to today's webinar on making the most of workforce data, external collaboration for actionable research. We're very pleased that you could join us today, and we're very excited that we have several great panelists with us today. I will introduce those in a moment. Next slide. So I'm Rachel Zinn, the Director of Workforce Data Quality Campaign, and also today with us we have from the Kentucky Center for Education and Workforce Statistics, Kate Akers, the Executive Director, and Justin Otto, the Marketing and Communications Lead and Business Analyst. And we also have Clive Belfield, Research Affiliate with the Community College Research Center and an Associate Professor at Queens College at the City University of New York. Next slide. I'm going to take just a few and introduce the Workforce Data Quality Campaign for those of you who may not be familiar. We are a nonprofit and bipartisan initiative that advocates for inclusive, aligned, and market-relevant education and workforce data that can help our nation's human capital policies meet the challenges of a changing economy. We work at both the federal and state levels to promote reforms for data systems that provide useful information for policymakers, students and workers, business leaders, and educators. At the state level, we have a blueprint that highlights 13 key features of a high-quality data infrastructure, and we address federal legislation in several areas, including promoting funding and technical assistance for states working on their own data systems. Our policy agenda is developed by a broad coalition of national organizations, state leaders, and technical experts who represent programs and interests across the entire education and workforce spectrum. Next. And some of our national partners are shown on the screen, and we also are foundation funded and greatly appreciate the support from our funders. So next slide. Let's get started with the topic for today. A little bit of background. Just want to set the stage by talking about state longitudinal data systems, which are really the foundation for the kind of activity we're going to be talking about today. Many states have created data systems that allow linking of data from different agencies and programs. These linkages allow tracking of outcomes from programs as well as combinations of programs. For example, transitions from post-secondary education into the workforce, as well as what kind of programs and pathways people on public assistance may take as they move into self-sufficiency. The whole point of these data systems is for the data to be used. A lot of states have constructed these systems and are still trying to figure out the best ways to make use of the data to help with things like performance management and accountability by looking at program outcomes, as well as assessing program impacts through research and evaluation that uses comparison groups to really find what the impact is of a particular program, comparing how people did who were in the program as compared to similar people who did not get that particular intervention. Next slide. States have found several ways to make use of their data contained in the longitudinal data systems. For example, several states have built their own internal research capacity. For example, the state of Wyoming has a team that works at the Research and Planning Office within their labor market office in the state. And they have done several studies using state data, including a recent study of youth mobility, looking at what types of jobs and geographic locations of those jobs for youth who are graduating from a particular high school cohort in the state. In addition, some states have contracted with research entities for specific projects. For example, a really exciting study just came out a couple weeks ago using data from Arkansas's state longitudinal data system. Arkansas contracted with Metis Associates, which is a national research firm based in New York City, and they published a study that demonstrates that low-income students who have participated in the Arkansas Career Pathways Initiative actually earn associate degrees or technical certificates at more than double the rate of the general community college population in Arkansas. So that's really an exciting finding and shows how the data can be powerfully used for impact studies. And finally, the focus of what we're going to be discussing today is that several states have created processes for outside entities to apply to use specific data sets. And I'm going to talk about a couple of states that have done that, and then going to let Kentucky and Clive talk about a couple of other state processes as well. Next. So Minnesota is one example, and they have really created a strong data governance structure. They have an interagency collaboration that governs their data system. It's their Department of Education, their Office of Higher Education, and their Department of Employment and Economic Development. External organizations can apply to get access to data that this interagency collaboration has linked together and created in the data system by submitting data access requests. These are standardized requests. There's a standardized form to fill out, and an interagency committee reviews these requests 3 times per year. And there is a standard rubric that is actually available on Minnesota's website that shows how requests are judged. And they're judged on a couple of things, including alignment with state research priorities. And the state is very clear about its research priorities. They call it the 4 Ps. There's pathways, which is the movement of individual students between K-12, higher education, and the workforce. Progress, which is the benchmarks or transition points that students meet or fail to meet along those pathways. There's predictors. Those are looking at the characteristics, patterns, or commonalities that help explain which students succeed and which do not. And then there's performance, which is how well our education and workforce aligned for individual success. Next slide. Within this construct, Minnesota protects privacy with a couple of different methods. One interesting thing that they do is they actually prescribe different levels of access to the data depending on the type of entity that is seeking access. So external researchers, for example, only see anonymized data. Anonymized data does not have any personal identifiers, no social security numbers, no names or date of birth. And in addition, anonymized data in this case does not have any special codes that can be linked back to the original data set. So researchers really need to be pretty specific about the data that they're looking for because they can't go back and link it to the original data set. On the other hand, state researchers, those within state agencies, have a higher level of access, which allows them to look at de-identified data, which can be linked back to the original data set. Minnesota currently has agreements with 2 external research organizations that are assessing dual credit programs that allow high school students to earn college credit even before they have their high school diploma. One challenge that Minnesota has with implementing their process is that requests do take 4 to 6 months to review. So it is a back and forth process, and researchers have to be pretty clear and present a compelling case about why they want the data. Next slide. New York is another example, and in this case, there's really been a legislative mandate that has made a big difference to how organizations in New York State have been able to access data, especially unemployment insurance wage records. There's limited data linkage capacity within the New York State agencies. The New York State Department of Labor, for example, does not have many data sharing agreements in place that can match education data to workforce data, specifically data that looks at employment outcomes through wage records at the agency level. So they've been able to still get research done with this data by using state labor law section 537, which was updated in 2013 to allow the New York State Department of Labor to share unemployment insurance wage records with federal, state, and local agencies to use for several specified purposes. And the language here is really nice and inclusive, and it allows sharing for such purposes as program evaluation in addition to legally required reporting. The law was passed because it was broadly supported by a lot of workforce development advocates in the state, such as the New York Association of Training and Employment Professionals. And our partner organization, the National Skills Coalition, was really instrumental in helping advocates to get that law passed. The law also includes strong language that mandates a transparent process for requesting the data. Next slide. So a couple of ways the data has been used. The City University of New York has been able to access a lot of the wage records and uses them to match with their student records and assess employment outcomes for a variety of major programs of study 3, 5, and 10 years after graduation. So they're really able to see what kind of earnings students can expect coming out of different majors. CUNY takes the data confidentiality very seriously. The New York State Department of Labor provides online data confidentiality and security training to all City University of New York employees who handle the data. And in addition, the university's research office holds monthly meetings with individual campuses to communicate data privacy expectations. Now, like Minnesota, there are some challenges with implementing the law. There is a $1,000 fee that the New York State Department of Labor charges to set up the initial data sharing agreements when a state or local entity applies to have data access. And some organizations, especially some of the smaller nonprofits, have found that challenging to kind of get in the door. And in addition, the data request process does take time, and some organizations have said that New York State has been slow to respond, and they still feel like access to, especially the wage records, is very limited. Next slide. So a couple of key recommendations coming out of looking at some of these leading states. All of the states that have succeeded in this area prioritize using data to inform policy and practice. It's not a technology project, it's really about informing action in the state. And they also have created very clear and transparent state research agendas. Second, legislation can support data sharing and mandate transparent processes for data requests. We can see, especially in the state of New York, the legislation has been very important, but it's not sufficient. Agency buy-in is really important for implementation, and that's why in this first bullet, statewide priorities and agency collaboration and coming up with those priorities is really important on top of legislation. And some other things that states can do can adopt this idea of allowing different levels of access for different types of users, as well as providing clear guidance to data requesters so that they can simplify their requests and make the most compelling case for why they need specific data elements for their research. And finally, we encourage states to keep exploring innovative ways to make data available while protecting privacy. For example, the state of Maryland is embarking on some research to try to develop synthetic data sets, which really means that they look at the data that they have and try to create a fake data set with imaginary individuals who are very similar to the individuals in their data set. So privacy is protected, but you would still get the same kind of results from the research on the synthetic data set. So really interesting, an interesting approach, and we're interested to see how that turns out. So we'd love to hear next from our colleagues at the Kentucky Center. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your process working with external researchers and some of the ways that your data has been used?
Thank you so much, Rachel, and I just want to thank you for the opportunity to share the work that we do. Next slide, if you don't mind. We'll go ahead and dive right in. So today I'm going to tell you just a little bit about our state longitudinal data system. I think that that'll really help frame the context of the work that we talk about, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the specific data that we have and how you can request that or how it has been requested. And then we're going to talk about really our marketing strategy, our culture here, and the processes that we've put in place around that. And then I think the best way to really talk about the work that we do in terms of collaborating is to actually talk about some of those key collaborations and the policy implications that have happened because of those. Next slide, please. So what is the center? So we are the center, or KCEWS, which rhymes with Dr. Seuss or Couscous. We were formerly called the P20 Data Collaborative. That's back to our education roots. So we changed it to something really easy to say, the Kentucky Center for Education and Workforce Statistics. So KCEWS, or the center, we are an independent state agency charged with maintaining Kentucky's state longitudinal data system. The system in Kentucky is a centralized system that brings together data, births all the way through workforce. We are a part of this national movement in terms of state longitudinal data systems, and we do have the legislative authority to collect data from all of these different education and workforce programs throughout the state. We are governed by a board that consists of the Secretary of the Education and Workforce Development Cabinet, and then the other board members are our agency leads, or the heads of all the education agencies throughout the state. Next slide, please. So what are we tasked to do? I mentioned the work that we do, and of course we couldn't do this work without our great team. So we do have our bios available online. I think that's probably the easiest way to see how we operate. I think it's really interesting to hear how some states have built kind of an in-house research group. Some have more outsourced that with the partnership of a research entity. Kentucky kind of does a hybrid of that. So I'm a statistician researcher by nature, so we've kind of led our office in that fashion. We also have a system architect. I mentioned our centralized system. We have an internally developed system. So the system architect, along with all of the developer staff, maintain that system. We have 5/5.5 research analysts that are from a variety of different education and workforce backgrounds. We even have a biostatistician. We have 2 psychometricians. So we have built a very strong research team that allows us to do a lot of research in-house, but we still actively partner with the research community outside of our office as well. Next slide, please. So what are we tasked to do? I mentioned our great team that we have, and the key piece in our legislation is that we are here to evaluate education and workforce programs throughout the Commonwealth of Kentucky. So to do that, we develop state-level metrics. And for us, that's really important. That allows us to see metrics across not only the education spectrum, but also into workforce. So as Kentucky, along with all of your states, transition from WIA to WIOA, we know those common measures are really important. So we're looking at those not only from a workforce training program, so adult education and Office for Vocational Rehabilitation, but also that impact on both the secondary and post-secondary, the way that we show information about their outcomes. So we do that for any of the metrics, any of the types of data and reports that we present. Some of the most important work that we do here at KCEWS is to monitor the privacy and confidentiality of the data in our system. So before we work with an external research agency, before we publish a report, the first thing that we always discuss before we even look and see what we're going to be examining in the report is to make sure that we maintain the privacy and the confidentiality of the data in our system. I'm a native Kentuckian, and so we're talking about my data. So it's very important to me. It's very important to the work that we do, that all of that is really at the forefront. And then we also monitor the data quality in our system. Perhaps the easiest example I can give of the importance of data quality, with poor data quality, as we go to match our secondary to our post-secondary data, a poor data quality match there would mean that our college going rate might go down, so if we're unable to match those sources across systems. And of course, to do all this, we do have to maintain what's called the Kentucky Longitudinal Data System. So that is the name of our P20W system here in Kentucky. And of course, without that system, we wouldn't be able to answer all of these research questions and collaborate with researchers the way that we do. Next slide, please. Those of you that may not be familiar with a centralized system or an internally developed system, this is just a really quick overview. On the left-hand side, this is an example of K-12 data. So we receive primarily annualized records from our K-12. Those come in, some of those, as you can probably assume, at the state level. We may have some duplicates in there, students with multiple student IDs. We may have multiple students with the same ID. So the process that we do in our dynamic matching system allows us to match those records and then create what's called a master person index. So this would be one record per person that then follows longitudinally. Now the important piece of this is that as soon as those data are matched, and only certain specific individuals in our office even have access to that data, all the identifiable data are actually stripped away. So all of those data that might indicate some, a unique identity are actually all swept away prior to our researchers ever having access to it. And that would include researchers outside of KCEWS as well. So there's no way for us to be able to give out anything that's identifiable. Next slide, please. Some of the current data in our system, we've talked about K-12 student data, K-12 teacher and staff data, as well as our post-secondary data, proprietary colleges. We also include information from our state in-state employment and earnings system. That's our unemployment insurance system, both wages and claims. We have data on early childhood and kindergarten readiness. That's getting to that birth side of the P20W, as well as out-of-state, post-secondary, and that would include our proprietary colleges. Information on financial aid. Some of our newer is around career and technical education students. So these would be primarily at the secondary level, students going along that specific pathway. And we're finding that that's some of the most useful data to our workforce community. On the right-hand side, you can see some of the data that we are pursuing in the near future. This is really what we're looking at in FY17. So in this next year, we're looking at bringing in data from Head Start, additional data from the Cabinet for Health and Family Services around early learning programs, apprenticeship data from the Department of Labor. Out-of-state and military employment continues to be something that we struggle with in Kentucky. Kentuckians, by nature, we actually don't move around a lot, which is a little bit different here in Kentucky, but we know that there are specific populations that are working out of state or that are moving out of state. And then we also have a military population here in Kentucky, those of you that may be familiar with our geography. And so we think that it's really important that we're able to capture those individuals. Workforce demand data is very important. On the left-hand side, everything you see there is really about supply. So we can tell you what types of credentials folks are earning, what that pipeline looks like. Students that are enrolled in career technical education programs, we can talk to you about their pathways. But the demand side of data we think is very important. So we have partnered with the Cabinet for Economic Development. We've looked at labor market indicators data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And then we're also beginning to look at data that are being collected at the local level from employers. So who better to tell us what the demand is in their field than the actual employers themselves? So the question that we have is really around how do we collect that type of data at the state level? And then another piece that we're now looking at is healthcare licensure data. So specifically, when you think about going and seeing a physician, you're looking for a board-certified family physician. So those boards collect very specific data about those that are licensed to practice in their specific field. So we think that this is a really critical piece of both the supply and the demand work that we're doing to be able to bring in that data so we can offer some more information about what's needed in Kentucky and what's coming through the pipeline. Next slide, please. I'll go through the next ones fairly quickly, but the first one is just this is my very non-technical picture of our system. So on the outside, you can see all of the different large partner agencies that we work with. All of their data is then brought into our centralized system, which again is the Kentucky Longitudinal Data System. Next slide, please. And one of the key things that we work with here, the Kentucky Longitudinal Data System, it's not an IT project. Although you can talk to me and figure out that I do really love data and I'm very passionate about data, but the exciting part and the real passion that we have here at KCEWS is the ability to get the data out. So I'll talk a little bit about some different ways that we get the data out, but essentially we have data coming out of our system in the form of standard reports. Those are all available on our website. They're currently in PDF and Excel. We also answer a variety of data requests. We do policy evaluation as a third-party evaluator on grants for education cooperatives, workforce boards, and then we also build custom reports and do analyses as needed. Next slide, please. So there are two general types of data requests that we answer here at KCEWS. One is for aggregate data. The majority of data that touch workforce do come through the aggregate data pipeline. So there are several steps that go along with that. The first is just a statement of work. So before we kind of assign a research analyst to that work or a business analyst or whichever the case may be, we want to get a really clear picture of what the requester is looking for. So sometimes that's just a research question, sometimes it's an example of something that they've seen in another state or perhaps another industry sector, and they want to see how KCEWS can help them answer a specific question or meet a specific need that they may have. Then our team here completes the report as requested. We have very specific guidelines about how we can release data in terms of cell counts, in terms of not being able to identify any specific employer. And then we distribute that report to our partner agencies. So these partner agencies are the agencies that actually where the data originated. So if the data included have information from the Council on Post-Secondary, so some post-secondary data, they would then have 10 business days to review the report, and then they respond with any comments that they may have about confidentiality, privacy, etc., and then we're able to transmit that report to the requester. We do operate on cost recovery, which makes us a very, very inexpensive option for a lot of folks that are looking for different types of data. So we essentially just bill, and that's a part of that statement of work, for the amount of time that our research team uses to build the report. The second way that researchers can receive data from KCEWS is through a de-identified data file. So we talked earlier about how the data coming out of the research side there's no way that those can be identifiable. So essentially, if there are data that need to be matched, if you have perhaps a workforce training program and you know those individuals and you want to see some program evaluation about them, you would have to send those individuals to us. We would then send them through the matching process, just like we do with all of our other data sources. And then we're able to create a de-identified data set with that. So with this requires a memorandum of understanding. So we comply by all state and federal privacy guidelines, and which would include the destruction of data, the storage of data, etc. So that memorandum of understanding, or MOU, outlines that. And then once everything is signed, we then are able to transmit the data to the requester through our secure FTP site, and then we, of course, follow up as needed. So those are the two primary ways, and again, the majority of our workforce data really falls on the aggregate data side. Next slide, please.
Hi, this is Justin Otto, the Marketing and Communications Lead for KCEWS. Before I get started on this slide, I do want to thank the staff at the WDQC for all their help in putting this webinar together. It's been seamless and easy, and any chance our office gets to present or talk about the work that we are so passionate about, we jump to it. So we're really excited. First, with the KCEWS culture, one of the things we really try to stress within our office, we've got, as you saw in the previous slide, 21 staff members ranging in skills from developers to a researcher or business analyst, administrative staff, project managers, system architects. And we really try to make sure we all have the same story when we talk about KCEWS. So if we're at a social gathering or at a meeting or at lunch and we start talking about our office, we really try to stress that, one, we know what our office does. We can talk about what some of the reports that we do, some of the work, the agencies that we work with, and we also know what we can and can't talk about. So if by chance there's specific questions that maybe you run into a news reporter or a policymaker while you're getting lunch and they start asking specific questions about data that you may not know, you know, we really advocate that staff member gets their information and gets back so we can tell them the accurate data. We really tell our staff that it's okay to not know on the spot. It's better for us to get back and find out exactly what they're looking for. And then with our office, we really push something that we call the 3 Ps. So promote, participate, and present. So everyone in our office, again, whether it's a developer, a researcher, or a business analyst, we are all passionate about the work that we do, and we really believe that it's helping the Commonwealth of Kentucky. So we really try to promote our office and what we do because we think it's cool. I think we all think we're special because it takes a special person to get excited about data. And we can see some pretty tangible outcomes that Dr. Akers will go through when we speak about some of the examples we've got with external research groups. And then participate. So we want our staff to really try to go to, whether it's local meetings, national meetings, different groups, different discussions. We want to be part of those discussions because the way that we promote ourselves is to go and let people know that, one, that we exist. For the longest time, we would go speak to policymakers and different agencies and researchers, and we kept hearing, wow, you guys are the best kept secret of Kentucky. So our mantra has been, let's not be the best kept secret of Kentucky. Let's really try to tell people about what we do, how we can help them, and how we can participate in the projects they're working on. You know, giving them some actual examples instead of anecdotal evidence, and then present. So once we start participating and promoting our agency, we really try to present to these groups. I think, for example, this week, several of our staff have presented either to healthcare workforce groups, the local licensure board for nursing, the workforce investment areas for Kentucky. Right before this presentation, Dr. Akers literally sped walk to my office to start this, but we really try to fill our schedules, and it's never for us a burden to present. We welcome the opportunity, and we're also just a quick example, not to say these are the only examples, but another quick example is school superintendents. So we've been on kind of a Kentucky road show where we've been going from different co-ops of school superintendents and presenting them to say, hey, this is how we participated. We've got someone that retired superintendent that was superintendent of the year in Kentucky use our office to pass one of her programs in her district. So she's able to say, hey, this is how they participated in my project. We want to present this information to you to promote the office so it can help you. So it's cyclical, not necessarily in that order, but we really try to stick by those 3 Ps. Next slide, please.
Justin, just wanted to do a time check, just for time considerations, if we can wrap up and move to Clive in just a moment.
Perfect.
Yeah, perfect. So some of our kind of key external examples and examples really of the key policy areas that these have seen in Kentucky. So we put up a couple of our key partnerships. One is with the Harvard University Strategic Data Project. That's a project on college going. And so the policy implications of that are they built a really dynamic dashboard that was really helpful for superintendents to be able to see information that KCEWS has produced, but in a way that's a little bit more friendly to them. And the policy implications of that are really down at the strategic planning level. So what does that mean for an individual school district or high school when they're able to see their college-going rates dynamically? The Regional Education Laboratory, the RELs, we work with very specifically, and the policy implications there are around dual credit, dual enrollment, which to us has a direct implication into the workforce side, looking at career technical education, both at the secondary and the post-secondary level. And the unique policy implications here are that the first step identified that the data that were collected, the quality were not good. So before they could even make policy recommendations about dual credit, dual enrollment in Kentucky, they really needed Kentucky to begin to implement a policy about better data quality and better data collection. Specifically on the workforce side, we partner with Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce. Kentucky is beginning to move towards a performance-based funding model for our post-secondary institutions, and we found that that's actually much more effective if we have the data behind it. So we have data and information on outcomes by specific program area, by institution level, that we're then able to work with our council on post-secondary to tie in with qualitative data about the success of those students and about its implication on Kentucky. And then we have several other initiatives that we've been able to work with. One is with one of our local workforce investment boards, and that's Kentuckiana Works, so that's the Louisville area. And they had a youth program that they wanted us to do an analysis on. So, this program evaluation that we did, just this program alone showed an increase in post-secondary participation for these youth that were engaged in the program. And probably most exciting, even though they were doing all of this intensive work, actually being placed in employment opportunities, they really weren't any worse off in terms of attendance, in terms of long-term employment opportunities as well. Then we have several other pieces in looking at advanced placement opportunities in Kentucky and other dual credit, dual enrollment, and what we see are really positive outcomes for both post-secondary and the workforce. So we're able to partner both with external entities such as Georgetown University or Kentuckiana Works, but we also are able to do quite a bit of work in-house as well. And we believe that it's that key partnership that's allowed Kentucky to produce a variety of different reports and to really, in the end, make the biggest impact on policy that we possibly can. Next slide. And again, we just want to thank you all for the opportunity, and we look forward to working with you all in the future.
Thank you so much. That's really great information. And Clive, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the research that you've been able to do with data from a variety of states?
Okay, thank you so much. So I'm going to talk about this from the perspective of CAPCE. CAPCE is the Center for Analysis of Post-Secondary Education and Employment. And CAPCE is located at Teachers College, Columbia University. And it's a team of researchers from various states. And we've been looking at labor market data mostly after the Great Recession and trying to link that to post-secondary transcripts and maybe high school transcripts if we have them to get to perform research on labor market outcomes for students. Next slide, please. So the CAPCE agenda is basically to look primarily at the earnings and employment benefits of community college students and what type of programs and policies will improve their outcomes, mostly their labor market outcomes. And we've been trying to use large-scale data sets, statewide community college system data for first-time in college cohorts, linked with National Student Clearinghouse data because so many students transfer from college to college, and then linked to unemployment insurance wage records before, during, and after college. So that's a lot of data sets, and our approach has been as kind of a wandering around the country to various states trying to get their data on transcripts, transfers, and earnings, and those, Arkansas, etc. Those are some of the states we've been able to work with to try to look at employment and earnings benefits of post-secondary education. So what I'd like to talk about here is just kind of some of the procedural elements of what we've been doing, and then also very briefly talk about some results. So there's a much longer presentation on the KCEWS website of this, and then finish with some of the things that have, how should we say, made us less successful than we would have hoped to have been in working with this type of data to inform policy. So those are the three things I'd like to talk about. Next slide, please. So because we need basically three, or if we go to the student level, 4 different data sets, we've primarily had to work through a college system and then use that as our anchor data set, and then see if we can span out from the college system, starting with college records, to move towards transfer records and employment records, and then back down to high school records. And so the first thing we need is our incredibly good relations with college systems. And it's certainly very nice to have data warehouses, but we've been trying to work with college systems to get the data and also to work with them on research questions that they need answering. And that's been something we've been trying to emphasize, is that researchers can come in and perform all sorts of descriptive and analytical work, but we've wanted it to be related to things that some agency is working on, and we focused on the colleges. So we needed very good relations with college systems, and then those college systems would need to be linked to UI systems, either through Department of Labor and Commerce. And we have found that that is something highly variable from state to state and also not static. So we've had states where it has been very easy to get data and then suddenly very difficult. And then, as Rachel mentioned, New York has become much easier to work with than it used to be. Obviously, we require IRB requirements for these studies, and that takes time to negotiate. When we get this data, we typically would expect course level flat files. One of the things we have been working with and found, but unfortunately have not made as much progress with, is that aggregated data includes so much within student variation that it's really not helpful to work with highly aggregated data. And so we have typically asked for data that's at as flat a level as is possible. So that is the course level. So that's Econ 101, semester 2016, the fall, the spring of 2016 semester, Econ 101, and your grade in that course. So it's a very granular data set that we would expect to use. And one of the reasons why we've had to work with college systems as much as data warehouses is because when we think about the samples, we really need to know specifically what we're dealing with in terms of years of coverage, student groups, and UI coverage. And as an outside researcher, you think, oh, a student is a student, and you suddenly realize that there are many, many different types of students with many different status levels. And the three that we have been worried about the most are the transfer students who come in and out, so we don't know how much college they had before they started at a particular institution. So there's the transfer students, the non-credit students are a large group, and then the dual enrollment students are a non-trivial proportion of students too. And then we have issues with UI coverage, because some states have UI coverage across states and others do not, and that may or may not matter. So New York, unfortunately, does not have great coverage for New Jersey workers. So that causes us a little bit of a problem in that we don't know whether you've gone out of the labor market or moved to New Jersey for if you're missing from our data set. And the years of coverage we found is particularly important because it's now 2016, so if we want labor market outcomes, we have to give you a few years in the labor market, so that takes us to 2012, let's say. And then if we need you to have actually completed a BA, that takes us all the way back to 2006. So you're entering college in 2006, and only now are we getting information about how well you've done in college. And so we need to know the years of coverage is a particularly important thing for us to figure out, and that's why we like to work with college systems to determine how long we have to go back, because we have to go back quite a way, even if we want to give you up to date, even if we want to give you recent news, we're still talking recent is 2006 entry cohorts for us. So those are a lot of the issues that we've had in terms of moving from a simple researcher's way of thinking, which is could you just send me the data, to what exactly is the process behind getting that data from the record systems into the hands of researchers. And we've had less success with moving that down to high schools than we have moving it up from 2-year to 4-year colleges. Next, please. So we have produced a set of results, and there are a lot of papers on the KCEWS website with results from our analysis of Transcript-UI data. Next slide, please. So there is information there. Here's a kind of an overall slide of what we have for the returns to an associate's degree over no award across 6 different state data systems across all the students in colleges, probably starting in about 2003. And so this is data on their earnings around about 2008, around about 2011, 2012. So you can see some of the returns to getting an associate's degree over attending a community college and not completing in community college. And you can see a pretty consistently high return, but we can also see a lot of variation across states in returns to an associate's degree. Next slide, please. And then if we look at this, economically it's a very large number. It's a lump sum return of maybe $70,000 for males and $135,000 for females. So these are pretty big numbers, but as you can see, we have to go out quite a way. We have to go at least 8 years in order to get a reasonable estimate of returns to college, even for associate's degrees, not including BA degree students. Next slide, please. Now, it's a little easier and faster to do this with certificates, but it turns out that you also need a pretty long window to look at certificates too, because what we found is, next slide please, the certificates do give you positive returns over not completing a community college award, but they tend to fade out. So even though we can sort of identify a boost from a certificate, we're not sure how long that boost is, whereas for an associate's degree, we're thinking that the bump in earnings goes on for a longer amount of time. So I guess the conclusion from these slides is that we need a pretty long window of data in order to make statements about college students and their subsequent earnings from different either awards or programs of study or subfield of study to help policymakers. And we were surprised at how long the window was, but nevertheless, it is a pretty long window of data. So it requires quite a bit more data than we had anticipated when we started this KCEWS research. Next slide, please. Now, one of the, and I guess I'll skip over this because I know we're kind of crunched for time. We did some disaggregated work. one of the things we've tried to emphasize in our research is the difficulty of looking at aggregate data. And this slide just shows median earnings aggregated by college across the 3 main types of college in the US. So these are median earnings 10 years after enrollment. And you can see that even though there's a big gap between the public 4 years and the for-profit 2-year colleges, there's also a pretty wide spread of median earnings per institution. And our efforts have largely found that the variation of college or variation in institution in labor market outcomes is much smaller than the within college variations. So you have plenty of students in community colleges who could do well in 4 years, and plenty of 4-year students who would have been better suited to community colleges. So for us, this is a little bit of a problem because we try to work with institutions, but if we try to compare institutions, we typically say there's as much within institution variation as there is across institution variation. So that's been one of the things that has kind of hampered the dissemination of this work, is the lack of institutional rankings, which we know that people want to do, and they obviously provosts and presidents would rather have policies per institution, but we found that institutional differences are not as large as within student differences. So next slide, please. So in the conclusions, those are some of the conclusions of our findings. Given the few minutes I have left, we've been trying to think as CAPC has progressed why we haven't been able to do more than we've done. And we've come up with 3 or 4 main reasons. The first is that it is a lot more work to do the analysis than we initially anticipated. It takes a lot of time, and there's a lot of coding and cleaning. Even with a great data warehouse, the researcher has to do a lot of cleaning, coding, and collating in order to get the data into shape. So that is something that makes it a lot harder. There's a lot more work involved than you would anticipate. Now that has implications for contracting, because just getting data from a warehouse is one thing, but you really need a significant amount of research or resource in order to perform a study, and you kind of need that money, that grant money, before you get the data. But if the data takes a long time to get, then you've got some timing issues there in trying to get a project completed. So that's one reason. The second reason why this data is not as useful as it might be is that some of the conclusions tend to be pretty obvious and ones we've seen for many decades. So the very high returns to community college, the high returns to completing an award, the high returns to health, even the low returns to for-profit colleges, and the lack of a clear pattern by institution. These are kind of not new findings, they're just restatements of initial findings. Now related to that is that some of is the issue of we are always kind of behind. We're looking at data that's from students who enter in 2006, and we say, well, we can look at how they did right now. We have to wait 10 years. And of course, we've had a great recession in the last 10 years, so we don't know whether the last 10 years the next 10 years is going to look anything like the previous 10 years. And the labor market from 2006 to 2016 did not look anything like the labor market from 1996 to 2006. So we may be limited in how well we predict if the labor market changes a lot. And then a third thing for researchers, particularly our approach, was that we wanted to work with colleges and policymakers, and so we need to find information that not only that they needed, but also that would make them change their behavior. And I guess it's no surprise to most of the audience, but getting people to change their behavior is extremely difficult, and and that is something that we have tried to structure our information so that it really makes colleges do something different. And, well, how to say that? That's a lot harder than it sounds. So I realize I've gone pretty fast, but I know that, Rachel, we wanted to get in within the time we had available. So those are just some of the thoughts from the other side, the kind of the user perspective of these large-scale data sets. All of the information, thank you, all of the information that I've talked about is available at the KCEWS Center website. So if there's any more information that people need about the research, that's all on the website. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we are about at time, but we have a bunch of folks who are still sticking in on the phone. So we'll go just a few minutes over because we do have some questions coming in. I'd like to get to a few of those. And if we do not get to your question that you sent in, and feel free to send in others, we will definitely follow up with questioners after the webinar with answers. So one question we had was for the Kentucky team. What % of your budget is covered by the fees you charge for data, and what sources fund the rest of your budget?
Right now, we are probably at about 5% user fees, so very low. About 70% is from federal grants. We have, I think, at least 4 active federal grants, and then the other 25% is from our state general funds.
Great, thank you. And this is a question for both panelists. What's a data set that you haven't been able to access yet but would really like to get your hands on? And what would be the implications of receiving that data? What good could you do with it? Do you have a dream data set?
This is Kate in Kentucky. I'll go really quickly. And in general, we think about outcomes as like a pie. So we have a really good handle of what's going on here in Kentucky for those that are participating in our unemployment insurance system. But what we really need is that magical wand that tells us what that percentage, that percentage of folks that we just can't find. So they may be out of state, they may be military, they may be working in some type of fashion that's not being reported. So if we could have a magic data set, it would tell us the outcome information for that missing piece.
Okay, well that's a great question. It's pretty easy for us because our dream data set does exist. It's the IRS master file of tax return, which some people can get hold of, but not many people. And we would get hold of that.
Great, thank you. And why don't we wrap up with just one more question? We've got a couple audience members who are asking variations of this. So there were, if you could wave the magic wand, right? And either there were state policies or federal policies that could be changed to facilitate your work and make it easier for external researchers to access data with appropriate privacy protections and actually use that data for the kind of research that you're talking about. Do you have examples of policies you would like to see revised or things you'd like to see state and federal policymakers think more about?
This is Kate. I'll tackle this first, and I'll say that Kentucky, fortunately, our policies do work fairly well for the work that we do. The policies around our wage data specifically are very tight, and although it would be really easy for me to say, yeah, it would be great, we should just revise those policies, I think that they're there for a reason, and and we do have concerns about what it would be like to share, anything identifiable, for example. So I would say that although I think that policies, of course, should be looked at, I would also say that right now we think that ours are working in the best interest of the folks in Kentucky.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, the issue is not so much that the data is around and we can't get access to it. It's that it takes us much more time to work with it than we had ever anticipated. And so it's not the availability of the data, although sometimes the data are not available. It's that once you get that data, there's still a long way to go on the road to get something useful for policymakers out of it, and particularly if it's just administrative data, then you're always in a correlational type world, and you have to think of ways to craft the analysis so that you can get some conclusions that appear more causal than correlational. So I appreciate that it would be great if the data was just piped to us every day, but it would just pile up on our desks, I think, if we got a lot more data than we currently have, given the resources we have to analyze these data.
Great. Well, that seems like a good note to end on, that you know, both data availability and capacity to do something with that data are both very important as we all think about how to move forward. So thank you to both of our panelists. Really appreciate your time this afternoon, and thank you so much to those who joined us. We will be following up with those whose questions didn't get addressed, and there will be a link to a recording of the webinar up on our website at workforcedqc.org in a couple of days, and we'll also send around the link to that recording to everyone who registered today. So again, thank you all very much. Really appreciate your time.